everybody. Back in June of last year, June 2024, I had a young writer on the show, Andrew Lipstein. He'd sniffed something rotten in the American financial system. He wrote a cover piece for Harper's entitled, "What Goes Up? Does the Rise of Index Funds Spell Catastrophe?" There hasn't been a catastrophe yet, at least on the index funds front, but his argument, I thought, was pretty interesting. But Lipstein's main thing is not as a financial analyst or nonfiction writer. He's a novelist, and he has a nonfiction book out this week, appropriately called Something Rotten. And he's joining us from Brooklyn, where, Andrew, nothing's rotten in Brooklyn, is it? Is it the one place left in America where there's nothing rotten?
Everything here is perfect. I don't know what you've heard, but no problems here.
The People's Republic of Brooklyn. I'm on the other coast, the People's Republic of San Francisco. So back to the new book, Something Rotten, of course, taken from Hamlet. You're primarily, although correct me please if I'm wrong, a fiction writer. Is there a big difference between writing fiction and nonfiction on the Something is Rotten front?
Yeah, I mean, if you keep on showing the Kirkus site, we should show the Publishers Weekly site instead, because Kirkus didn't give me a star, even though they gave me a fantastic review, but Publishers Weekly did. So I think we should throw some impressions.
Okay, well, we now know that you should never look at Kirkus, only look at Publishers Weekly. I don't have the Publishers Weekly one up, but I got the Kirkus one. So anyway, we know that it comes with a symbolic star, even if they didn't give you one.
I think so. There is the biggest difference for me is that writing nonfiction is so much harder. Just on sorry if you could hear some babies in the background, it won't be the case shortly, but just on like a production level, it takes me probably 2 or 3 times as long to write a single paragraph for nonfiction than for fiction, and I find it so much less enjoyable. Let me actually change rooms. I think it'll be okay. But I'm actually working on a nonfiction book now, and I have to say that it's just like, as a whole, is just so much less enjoyable for me, and so much more of a struggle. And the idea of writing a novel now seems like would be a vacation for me.
So tell me about the novel, Andrew. It's your third book after The Vegan and Last Resort. The Vegan did very well. I sort of made a name for yourself. Is it really about something rotten?
This book, more than any of my others, has like a bona fide hard-boiled twist to it, and there is something incredibly rotten that I think the reader will start to be keen on as they move through the book.
Well, I'm pleased you found a way of including my show in your response. Keen on something rotten. Tell me a little bit. We want people to buy the book. You're a poor author, so we need to make sure you're making a living. But tell me a little bit about the narrative. What is the fiction in the book?
Yeah, well, first of all, folks are concerned about my finances, they can just Venmo me directly. But the book itself, the book takes place in Copenhagen as an American man and his Danish wife are traveling for their parental leave. And, obviously the book is so much about culture, but more than anything, it's about our perceptions of truth as well as masculinity. The protagonist, Ruben, is a canceled former NPR host who's been caught in flagrante with his wife and fired for it. And basically for 2 straight years has been down on his luck, disgruntled, feeling like his masculinity is repressed in liberal society, and moves to Copenhagen for the summer and sort of gloms onto the character of Mikkel, who is an extremely forthright and provocative masculine man, a prominent high-powered journalist. And Ruben sees in him a sort of new model of masculinity, one that wouldn't have been even sort of allowed in his formerly liberal milieu.
We've done lots of shows on supposed crisis of masculinity, particularly in America. We had Richard Reeves on the show.
I read that book. Yeah.
Of Boys and Men. Is this one of these books, Andrew, where Americans go to Denmark to find out the solution to all their problems?
I don't think. I mean, I think in many ways Denmark is an objectively better country than the U.S., but I don't think their solutions would work here, and I'm definitely not suggesting that we simply copy them. But I think the Reeves book is interesting and actually very different as far as its take on masculinity, because he's talking about basically men, American men in total. I'm not necessarily writing to an audience that is taking all of America into account, but masculinity in particular as it exists in a place like New York or San Francisco, and what sort of masculinity is even allowed by the current liberal values. I thought his book was very good, though, and I thought it brought up some really interesting issues. One of the issues it brought up is actually red-shirting men, basically having them start school a year later, and that idea has actually been very popular in Denmark, as I think a lot of ideas which are sort of very practical and logical, objectively. But I'm curious why we can't consider that in the U.S.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like you, Reeves has 3 boys. His are much older than yours, but your boys you got twins, 1-year-olds and a 3-year-old. So you're about to experience certainly boys, if not men. What is it about Denmark, Andrew, that obsesses progressives? I don't know if you remember from 2016, there was a big to-do between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton about Denmark. Bernie was going on and on about something in Denmark, and Hillary said, well, that's all very well. I love Denmark, but America isn't Denmark. Is there something symbolic in progressive culture about Denmark? Do we all go to Copenhagen and wish we were home?
Yeah, well, there's a few aspects to it. I mean, I think a very big positive and a very big negative. The very big positive is their approach to, what we unfortunately call socialism is extremely logical. And they have a super high taxation system, and it's more on income than it is for wealth. And what you find in Denmark is you just don't find people who make obscene amounts of money without giving most of it back to the country. And what that also means is that it's very rare to find somebody who is struggling financially, and everything that finances provide, specifically health and education. There's obviously universal healthcare, not that it doesn't have its flaws over there. You can get an education until your heart desires. Denmark actually paid for my wife to get her master's degree in New York. It's an extremely...
Is she Danish, your wife?
Yes, she's Danish. It's an extremely sane, empathetic system, and it's kind of like what a government should be if it was built for all of its people. The reasons why I think some of the Danish learnings wouldn't work when applied to America is we're fundamentally different society. We are so much more diverse. We're so much more heterodox. We have so many different conceptions of priorities and values and what it means for a country to be good, that I don't think it would so easily work. And sort of the underside of Danish society being so, welfare based, is that there is a strong sentiment that people should act in accordance with the same cultural values. There's a much more stronger invisible force around what it means to be Danish and subscribe to the Danish way of life. And if you are in Denmark and not doing that, I think partly because of the strong welfare system, you're seen as sort of an aggressor on the system.
So in other words, to shorten that, would it be fair to say that Denmark, certainly like other Scandinavian countries, although I'm not sure Denmark is a fully Scandinavian place, is more of a conformist place? It's harder to be a non-conformist in Denmark as opposed to the US?
Yeah, I think conformism first, Denmark isn't, I think, fully in Scandinavia. I think conformism is a good concept to use here, except in America, I still attach it to like the Gen X mindset of being anti-corporate, and conformism sort of being synonymous with like corporate messaging and capitalism. Whereas there, it's just seen as like, yeah, we all did the same thing, and that doesn't have to be related in any way to a commercial context.
Given that you're married to a Dane, and you've obviously spent quite a lot of time, is she from Copenhagen, your wife?
She is from an hour outside of Copenhagen.
So you've obviously spent some time there. How autobiographical is this novel?
I think the facts of my and my wife's lives, if you wrote them on paper, it would seem pretty autobiographical, but the characters themselves are not us. One of the main characters in Copenhagen, Mikkel, is based off of a friend of mine, basically one to one. But as far as what happens and the tenor of the novel, I wouldn't call it autofictional.
Yeah, you never got caught having sex in public with your wife.
Well, if I had, you'd probably know about it.
Well, you never worked for an NPR, of course, is an institution which is not hard to satirize. Is that fair?
It's very easy to satirize. I think even liberals like satirizing it. They're sort of the last bastion of a national, fully liberal news source that sort of not just short of openly, wouldn't take any perspective into account that wasn't liberal.
You're a literary man, Andrew. What's happened in Denmark since Shakespeare wrote Hamlet? I mean, his treatment of Denmark was very different from, and the rottenness of Denmark was very different from the Denmark of the 21st century. You're not a historian, or you're a fiction writer, but what can we learn about the last few hundred years of Danish history in terms of going from a rather brutal place to one which is more sympathetic?
I've heard, and maybe Danes wouldn't agree here, that there's like a rote saying that Danish people are the happiest people on the world because of some survey that was done years ago. I will say that they are quite happy and quite satisfied with life, and I was introduced to that fact with the context of they've basically lost every major war that they've been in in the past 100 years, and so it was.
Hasn't America as well? I'm joking, but
okay. Okay. But maybe those two things are related. I mean, not just like we spend whatever percent of our GDP on military and defense, but we are very engaged with the rest of the world, and we are very concerned with ambition. In Denmark, I feel like it's sort of shockingly unambitious, especially in terms of even how the idea of a successful businessman is presented, and how people talk about the time spent at work. It's almost like you should almost be shunned if you have at least a family and spend more than 50 hours at work a week. At the end of the day, I mean, I think that's a completely healthy, insane way of being. It's just so antithetical to the American way.
We've noted the egalitarian quality, or certainly the more egalitarian economic quality of Denmark versus the US. There's an interesting piece written a couple of years ago about making a living as an author. We've done this as a nonfiction author. As a fiction author. We've done lots of shows on this, and you were quoted about your vegan doing very well, but still making less money. Is it easier, do you think, to be a creative in a place like Denmark, a more egalitarian place?
I mean, absolutely. Just because, especially as someone with a family, when I think about my job and our way of life, I think about healthcare, I think about education, I think about saving up massive sums of money so that my kids can have more options when they get to the age of choosing school. If you're a struggling creative in America, you might actually be impoverished. You might be literally struggling to pay rent. Whereas in Denmark, all of those basics are paid for you. But on the flip side, I mean, I can't think of a country that has contributed more to the cultural landscape of the world than America. And maybe those two things also go hand in hand. I know that some of our friends in Denmark have noted that there's this concern over welfare's impact on ambition more generally, not necessarily the arts. But I think there's two sides to that coin.
In that Esquire piece, you were quoted as saying that writing is art, a form of expression, and something that I feel compelled to do. Is that what drove the writing of something something rotten? Because I assume it doesn't always pay the bills.
No, it doesn't. I mean, the levels of money that we need to live in a place like Brooklyn with 3 kids, even if I was an extremely commercial novelist, it wouldn't be enough. I fully appreciate the way our life is structured now, that when I go to write a book, I don't feel any pressure. Not that I could actually do it, but to write a bestseller. I'm not saying writing a bestseller is easy, or even I could ever do it if that's all I wanted to do, is create the most commercial book I could. But I think there's some really terrible art made for the sake of making money, and I think that force on writing or art of any sort is probably going to be negative in the end.
So many people aspire to be a novelist. You've done what most people haven't done, which is write publish novels by mainstream publishers. Is it worth it though? Do you regret it? You happy you've done it?
I can't imagine any novelist would regret it. I mean, I love it. I feel I failed to publish books for many years before I published my first Last Resort. And I would still be writing till the end of my life if I had never published a book. It's something I love, so I don't even regret it. Just based on the process, it's incredibly difficult and time consuming. But I think where many people trip up in their dream to write a novel when they don't actually succeed is because they don't actually want to do it. They don't take that much enjoyment in actually doing it. I think they want to have written a book instead of actually writing a book. So for me, I don't regret any of it.
Why do you think so many people think they have a novel in them?
I think people do. I mean, I think we all know that we have creative sides to us, and I mean, I think of creativity as something that you lose over time, not something that you gain. I think it's more of an absence of something, and I think a lot of people know from being a child what it means to be intensely creative, and as life goes on, and their neurons synapses harden, and they still feel that creative urge in them and want to take it out in some way. And I think a novel or a narrative form seems like the most obvious path, because we all dream at night. We all have the same capacity to be creative, and it's an energy that I think we all want to expend in some way.
Andrew, you don't need me to tell you of what's happening in America in the last few weeks, and will continue for the next 4 years. What's the point of a fiction writer, especially a satirical one like yourself, observing reality and getting us to think about how we live our lives and what our society is like, when nonfiction is so absurd, so hard to make up?
I think the point of fiction more generally, but especially my type of fiction, is to introduce moral questions. I think now more than ever, the moral questions are easier than they've ever been, especially if you already exist in a liberal milieu, a liberal place like New York or San Francisco. If you're a Democrat, if you believe women should have rights to their bodies, and all people should be able to vote. I think it's important to not let go of this idea of moral complexity in our lives just because it's so obvious that we should get this person out of office and prevent that appointee, or show disgust at this action, because I think it could make us morally complacent otherwise.
What are the moral questions that you're trying to introduce or get your reader to think about in Something Rotten?
I would say there's two big ones, maybe three. The first is, what do we want masculinity to look like? And what does it mean for us as a society to either support or not support men? The second is, what do we mean when we say something is truthful? And the last, I would say, is less of a moral question, but it's sort of on the boundary, which is, how should death be present in our lives? Maybe that's less of a moral question because it's less about moral priorities and more about just maybe more philosophical. But yeah, so the first 2 points, I would say.
And then, so let's go through those. One on masculinity, one on truth, and one on death. Big questions. What are we missing on masculinity that you wanted to include into the conversation in Something Rotten? I mean, this is I mentioned Richard Reeves. There've been many other books. We've done lots of shows on it. What most concerns you, particularly? I mean, you're obviously male, plus you have 3 young boys.
I think so. One of the biggest things satire does is it sort of takes something that's weird or a contradiction in society and blows it up, out of proportion until it's so noticeable by the reader that it has to be thought about. And a contradiction I see is, for a prominent liberal man or any liberal man to say in public something like, "I'm proud to be a man," it strikes such an off key, and it's just something you don't say because it's sort of so ridiculous. Or if you're pregnant, to say something like, "Yeah, I kind of hope that we're having a boy," something like that. Um, I think we've developed so many taboos about masculinity and men, and so sort of knee-jerkingly, reflexively um, presume men to be bad. And I think that's a contradiction in what we actually see in our daily lives and what we actually believe. I think it's become more of a public way of presenting yourself and a sort of an easy thing to say or react with. Um, so I think that's a contradiction that sort of goes unnoticed a lot, and a lot of that's about the difference between what we think in private and what we say or do in public. On the topic of truth,
Well, but before we get there, I
yeah,
want to talk about that in a second.
yeah.
But do you think it's a particular crisis amongst progressives? It doesn't seem as if the MAGA crowd are too
Well, that's
concerned
exactly it.
about talking about what it means to be male. They're not shy to express the
I
fact that
think
they'd like to have sons.
that's exactly it. I don't think that there's any cohesive liberal idea of masculinity, and in its absence, as a man and especially a young man, the rights idea of a man, as repugnant as it is to us, um, is cohesive. It's easy to understand. It's almost preempting what young men want to hear in sort of a disgusting way, but it's so much easier to understand, and it actually means something, as opposed to the liberal idea of masculinity, which is basically just like, um, be aware of your privilege, support other people, um, sort of vaguely, men are usually can be very bad. I don't think there are any sort of promotion of masculine traits or men in liberal society, and I think for that reason, you're finding other representations of masculinity much more attractive.
So are you, I'm sensing that as a clearly someone lives in Brooklyn, clearly a progressive, you're uncomfortable apologizing for your masculinity. You don't see any reason why you should.
There's so many things to apologize for. I myself have so many things to apologize for. The sex I was born with and the gender that I identify as are not something I should apologize for.
And is there a liberal idea of masculinity, or is it a post-gendered idea? Can one develop a masculine liberalism? Is there such a thing?
I'm not saying that there should be a masculine liberalism, like a political philosophy based on masculinity. I'm saying that the idea of masculinity has to exist. And to be clear, I'm not saying that masculinity is what men are and femininity is what women are. I'm not saying that there are two genders. In fact, I think there has to be a strong idea of masculinity to enable people who identify as male or female or anywhere in between, as man and woman or anywhere in between, to use in their identity. I think denying that there's such a thing as masculinity is a wishful thinking, and I can't imagine anyone actually thinks that.
Well, let's move on to the second thing that you're trying, the second moral question that you're introducing in the book, the issue of truth. Again, another issue that comes up all the time. What are you saying or doing with this challenge of figuring out truth? Does it exist? How do we represent it in this book that's different or new or original?
Yeah, so Ruben, the main character, is coming from America's conception of truth, which is basically like, if you can say something and write it down, and that sentence or statement turns out to be verifiably true, then you've done something truthful. And he's confronted with a different philosophy from Mikkel, who is basically saying that truth does not exist in just being on a side or saying what you believe in and having that be true, but actually having values that you can enact through action. And I think, especially as liberals, we are much more prone to instinctually want to be on the right side of history instead of doing things that can actually impact the world for the better. And it's never been easier to be on the right side of history and to profess things that are palatable to people in your slice of society. But I think those two ideas of truth, similar as they sometimes may be, are sort of entirely distinct.
Is there a philosopher or a philosophical school that you borrow from in some of these ideas of truth?
No, I mean, I'm sure that that idea or similar ideas have been enveloped by tons of philosophers, but there isn't someone in particular that I'm thought of.
I'm not sure if you do bring up Kierkegaard in this book. He's perhaps the most famous Danish philosopher, especially when it comes to the issue of death. I'm not sure if you've seen the new movie, The Room Next Door, which is about dying. What are you suggesting in the book about how we should think or represent death that's, again, important?
I think so. The character of Jonas in the book is someone who is an artist at heart who has sort of lost his passion to a corporate lifestyle. He's diagnosed with a rare fatal disorder, and suddenly realizes that he should, of course, quit his job and follow his passion. And as sort of like easy to swallow as that story is, I think it's actually pretty true to life. You hear about cases like this all the time, where people realize they're dying, and all of a sudden their values become clear to them, and especially the importance of their values. I think the presence of death in our lives is something that's often missing, especially when we refuse to do the courageous thing or the thing that actually matches our value system. So entering the book, I was really curious of this idea of the specter of death, or the idea of death getting closer and then further from characters, and how it affected their actions.
Are the Danish more open to euthanasia or arguments about euthanasia?
I'm sure they're more open to it. I know that the Netherlands, the Dutch people, are kind of the place to go for that sort of stuff. But it wouldn't surprise me, given the Danish way of viewing issues like that is always sort of, to an American perspective, almost radically practical.
The Americans come to Denmark, and of course they learn from Denmark. But do they teach the Danes anything in your novel?
What do Americans teach Danish people?
In the novel, in Something Rotten, do
I
they
don't think
bring something that the Danes think, wow, we could learn from these people?
I mean, Danes love New York City. They love they see a place like New York, and I think just the magnitude of possibility, as well as the level of ambition that people have in their lives, I think in and of itself is objectively admirable. And there's some mentions of that in the book, but given the characters in the book and what they represent and where the book takes place, it isn't really Americans are here to teach you something type of situation.
But did the Americans learn something from Denmark, or is it not that kind of book?
I hope the reader learns something about their own priorities for what a country can be.
Will it be read in Denmark? I mean, most Danes, of course, read English, but is this a book that you hope will? Well, I mean, of course, you hope it will sell in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, of course, I hope that it hasn't.
Are there different readers, though, when it comes to novels? In different types of readers, do you get the sense in Europe, particularly Northern Europe and the US, when it comes to these kinds of books? I mean, these works of contemporary fiction.
No, I mean, all of our friends in Copenhagen read just as many novels as our friends in the US, probably a lot more, actually. But literary culture in Denmark, and especially Copenhagen, is extremely teeming, as well as, I'm always surprised at how many prominent, popular, high quality newspapers Denmark has, considering the population is only 6 million people.
On your website, Andrew, you've got hundreds of blurbs about the book. Clearly,
hundreds might be an overstatement.
Well, certainly almost 100. Do you think blurbs are I'm always suspicious of blurbs with books, because it always seems to me, and maybe I'm being unfair, that writers get their friends to write blurbs. I mean, clearly you didn't do that, but maybe you have one or two friends in there. Do you think blurbs help sell books?
I think they're a necessary evil, and I think they don't hurt. I think probably their effect is overblown. I think on the plus side, it's nice as a writer to have someone you respect say something positive about your book, and to tell prospective readers that you've done the legwork to get the blurbs. On the downside, it sort of reinforces network effects and who you know. I mean, I think one of the biggest values of getting an MFA is potentially getting blurbs from the professors you studied from or the students you studied with.
So do the reviews still matter for books like this, NPR or New York Times or the other mainstream media? Or does it all depend now on, I know you're quite active on Instagram. Is it more of a social media thing now to sell books or at least get the word out?
I think reviews really matter. I mean, word of mouth matters so much, but I think to sort of help marketing and help publicize the book, reviews really do matter.
And what kind of sales does a book like this need? I mean, are we talking about thousands, tens of thousands for a book to break through as a novel?
For a novel to be considered successful, I think it would need to sell. I mean, I actually don't want to talk sales, especially because I know of a lot of books that I've really enjoyed that I think didn't get enough attention and their sales weren't that high. And I think, especially for literary fiction, like connecting sales to value isn't that productive. I'm sure you know about book advances and the probability of earning out. But a writer doesn't necessarily make all their money off of the sales, but they advance instead sometimes.
Finally, Andrew, what happened to the mustache? Last time you were on the show, you had a very distinguished mustache. Now you've shaved it off. Is that something to do with boys and men? Do real men wear mustaches?
Well, I knew I was coming on, and I didn't want viewers who are watching my last appearance to get it confused. So I shaved to make sure that there was some sort of visual discrepancy for them. I always like a change. I always like to shave my head occasionally or do something, as radical as I'm allowed, just short of getting any sort of different haircut. So shaving my mustache can feel like I'm exerting my power over myself.
Well, you've exerted your power over me, Andrew. Congratulations on the new book, Labor of Love. And more than a labor of love, it's an important new book by one of America's leading young writers. Don't be insulted if I call you young. You're certainly younger than me. Something Rotten by Andrew Lipstein. It's out this week. Congratulations, Andrew. And what's the nonfiction book you're writing?
I haven't really talked about it yet, so I don't have much to say.
Well, when you're ready to talk about it, we'll get you back on the show. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks so much, Andrew.